Good evening, everyone. Welcome. My name is Colin Anthony Chen, and I am the Associate Director for Undergraduate Outreach at the Stanford Center for Ethics and Society, the sponsor for tonight's event. The Center for Ethics and Society is committed to promoting research and fostering dialogue about society's most pressing moral challenges. Given these aims, the topic for this evening, free speech and the so-called cancel wars, is deeply relevant and urgent given the state of our potentially degrading public discourse. Our guest tonight, Professor Sigal Ben-Porath, will help us not only understand the underlying forces contributing to this challenging and changing landscape of discourse, but will also offer universities and K-12 educational institutions guidance on how to best respond to these potential threats to democracy. Sigal Ben-Porath is a professor of literacy, culture, and international education at the University of Pennsylvania's Graduate School of Education, with affiliate appointments in political science and philosophy. Sigal has also served as a research associate at Princeton Center for Human Values from 2001 to 2004, and was a recent resident fellow at Harvard's Edmund J. Safra Center for Ethics in 2020. Sigal's research spans across democratic theory and practice, with special emphasis on how universities can advance democratic ideals. Her most recent books include, of course, Cancel Wars: How Universities Can Foster Free Speech, Promote Inclusion, and Renew Democracy, published this year. She's also published Making Up Our Minds: What School Choice is Really About, published in 2019. She's also published Free Speech on Campus in 2017, as well as many other books connected to the topic of citizenship and education. Before I welcome Sigal to the podium, a brief word about the format for tonight's event. After roughly 30 minutes of opening remarks by Sigal, she will be interviewed by Stanford senior Liana Keesing, who's majoring in electrical engineering and is currently an Ethics and Society honors student writing a thesis on the ethics of surveillance technology. She is also an intercollegiate civil disagreement senior fellow. This is the second year she's been part of the program, which is offered through our center. So she's uniquely suited to interview Sigal about the problem of free speech in campus discourse. After the 30-minute interview with Liana, the remaining 15 minutes will be reserved for audience Q&A. We will have a microphone that you'll be able to be passed around by Jillian right here. She's going to be assisting with the microphone. You'll have 15 minutes for audience Q&A. After the event, there will be books sold. You probably saw that as you entered, but there will be books sold in the front, so you're welcome to purchase a book. And then after the event, if you would like your book signed by Sigal, there will be a couple minutes, 10 minutes or so, for you to engage with Sigal and have your book signed if you'd like. And without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Sigal Ben-Porath.
So thank you so much, Colin, for this introduction and for the invitation to be here. And thank you to all of the folks at the Center for Ethics and to you guys for being here in this pretty chilly evening. It's not what I heard about the weather here, so I feel a little bit cheated, but I'm still excited to be here and talk to you about some of these ideas that I discuss in this new book. I really want to start off by if we're going with the war metaphor, by drawing the battle lines. And so really to give you a sense of the kind of things that I worry about in the book and in my work more broadly, we are seeing restriction on speech expanding from various directions or various parts of society in recent years. And so we are seeing restrictions that are coming from government entities, whether they are state entities or other ones. For example, restrictions on teaching race, restrictions that for me are most worrisome about which books may be read in K-12 schools, restrictions on particular words and how they are used in government context, restrictions on the teaching about reproductive rights and about abortion in medical school, and of course, the Shawnee State case over here, disagreement and serious struggles over the use of pronouns for transgender students. And, you know, this is a topic I'm working on right now. You might already guess from my name and accent. I mean, I'm from Israel. And so the issue of students' concerns, particularly students and some faculty's concerns and struggles over the boundaries of what can be said about matters related to the Israel-Palestine conflict. And so, broadly speaking, the picture is of both restrictions that are coming from government entities down and are restricting the kind of conversations that we can have in K-12 schools and in higher education, as well as struggles over the boundaries of acceptable expression in classrooms, in, you know, outside on the lawn or the quad, and especially in classrooms, struggles that are reflected in demands from students to limit what can be said, and even to some extent a preference, reported preference by students and by some faculty to not wade into difficult territory. Why would I go into this? You know, this is probably just going to get me canceled, right? And so we are seeing this coming from the bottom up as well as from the top down. Generally speaking, this issue for me is of concern not just because of what is happening on our campuses, but really because this is in itself a reflection of the current democratic moment. And so I would like to situate these struggles within the broader context of polarization, which, you know, there's a ton of research about. I'm not going to go too deeply into that, but just generally to say that the United States, like many other democratic countries, is going through a process of rapid polarization. It's not unprecedented historically, but it's definitely quite distinct in the current era. We are seeing both elected officials or political elites polarizing, as well as the general public. So I'm going to skip, like, a lot of the discussion about this matter is around who started it, which I'm not going to go into too much. It's asymmetric and starting earlier and a little bit quicker on the right, but it's clearly happening on both sides of the ideological map or the eye. What's really important for me in this general picture of polarization is to note that instead of having two large tents, if we are thinking about the two sides of the political map or generally the two parties, two big tents where there are various policy perspectives and a part overlap between the two tents, we are now seeing two smaller tents, narrower, accommodating fewer positions, and more distant from one another, right? So we are seeing really a growing demand to move away from the center and towards a clearer and more defined ideological position. And this is affecting both national and local views across the board. The local views that are most affected evidently are related to schools, as I mentioned, and they really call on people to shift their views, their policy preferences on both sides of the political map in order to align with the narrower tent, right, with the more distinct set of ideological positions that are typical of the current ideological map. So this is really just very generally the research on polarization, as I said, both in the US and in other countries. What's most significant, in my view, for our topic is really the matter of polarized relationships, what some people call either affective polarization, emotional polarization, or sometimes ideological contempt. And so here we are seeing that the rapidly polarizing public sphere is affecting our assumptions about people who vote differently from us or people who have different ideological positions. I'm going to try, if I can, because let me tell you, the technology here is a challenge a little bit, but let's see. Okay, so a growing share of people on both sides of the aisle are thinking about people on the other side of the aisle as close-minded, dishonest, immoral, unintelligent, lazy, or all of the above, right? So not great, right? So basically, in a rapidly increasing shift starting in 2016, for some reason. In 2016, we are seeing a rapidly increasing negative assumptions or affective positioning about people on the other side of the political map. Okay, if this is working, then I'm going to give, okay, so I'm forgiving you about the weather because the technology is working. Okay. As a result of these changing positions, we are seeing very significantly reduced assumptions of good faith about people on the other side, right? So if I'm talking to a person who is voting differently than me, my assumption is going to be both that they are not very smart and that, that's not necessarily my assumption, right? But this is sort of like the common assumption, not very smart, and they are sinister in some way, right? They have some plan. They are trying to do something negative, right? I'm not assuming, oh, you're just thinking differently than me or you have different values. I'm assuming some kind of a negative motivation on their part. And so my trust in them or towards them and my inclination or motivation to really try and work out our differences is really reduced in this context of polarization. Therefore, I'm preferring to maintain some distance, right? Why would I want to interact socially or otherwise with people who are not smart and whatever was the other thing, immoral, right? So I'm basically choosing to maintain a relationship with my people, politically speaking, and maintain distance from out-group members. And increasingly, the people, and this is really important for our purpose, the people who are with me in my group, whichever group it is, right, politically, I'm demanding that they are not acting like people in that group, right? So my preference is increasingly, or my requirement is increasingly going to be that people adhere to the party line, right? And this, again, is creating a narrower tent. You cannot be on my side and have a policy preference on a certain topic that's aligned or more typical of the other side, right, on some important topic. Okay, so basically, this is the background into which come the discussions about speech, and they are reflective of fissures or cracks in the social foundations of democracy. And that's the reason why we should worry about them. Because a democracy, in order to function, needs not only our institutional foundations, the three branches, and, or the procedural foundations, such as elections and due process and other things. It also needs social foundations. So for a society to remain a functioning, self-governing society, it really depends on a set of social foundations that are at the heart, or well, foundations cannot be at the heart, I suppose, but they are, underlying the processes and the structures that we are sharing and making decisions about together. And so I want to note the two core areas of social foundations of democracy that I think are affected by the increased polarization, and particularly affecting polarization. So the first one is really our shared knowledge. The epistemic foundations of democracy are shared knowledge, or, if we want to be grand, sometimes truth, right? And so basically, polarization is creating the conditions whereby we are unable to share the same set of understanding about the reality that we are responding to in our policy preferences. And there are all sorts of reasons for that. So, some common assumptions about the increasingly distinct set of assumptions that we have across ideological lines have to do with the fact that we are increasingly getting our information from different sources, right? Whether it's the more traditional news sources that are ideologically increasingly distinct, or whether it is, the algorithms that are encouraging us to see more and more information that is aligned with our perspectives and preferences. So the knowledge that we have at our fingertips is distinct across our ideological differences, okay? Not only is the knowledge distinct, but also the evidence that is required in order to be convinced by somebody else's view. That's also distinct. So, for example, if you and I disagree on a certain policy or our perception of reality in some context, for example, again, we are somehow back to discussing whether masks are helpful in avoiding, COVID, and so, or other contagious diseases. And so, if you and I see this differently, you think masks are helpful and I think they are not helpful, or vice versa, what would be appropriate evidence in order for one of us to be able to convince the other? The question of evidence is also becoming increasingly distinct. What is the kind of evidence that's appropriate for changing my mind? And who can we ask, right? Who is an expert? What is a proper process for assessing the evidence in order to decide who between the two of us is correct about masks or whichever other topic, or who won the last elections? These are also distinct, right? Can we go to the courts? Can we go to the CDC? Can we go, to ask for scientific expertise? So the arbiters, or the bodies and individuals who are expected to offer us sort of like a conclusive decision about who among us is right, are also under dispute. So these are three levels of disagreement that are creating really a crumbling or a fissures, at least, in the epistemic foundations of society. So that's the one big area. And the other big area is the question of who belongs in society, who is a bona fide member of our democratic society, such that this person can be listened to, should have a voice in society, is an appropriate contributor to conversations that we are having about policy disagreements or about processes that we want to participate in. And so here too, briefly, and particularly in the context of developing new knowledge, we are becoming more and more distant from each other in regards to our definitions of the boundaries of who belongs. And this is affecting, again, what we are willing to listen to in our conversations, both on college campuses or in the context of developing new knowledge, and in society more broadly. Society and, this country and institutions of higher learning are increasingly more visibly diverse, and our effort to represent them as inclusive are increasingly causing us to look for ways to reflect this inclusion by making sure that people are not experiencing rejection, denigration, or a sense of questioning about their belonging. So these struggle over belonging are clashing with the boundaries of expression that we are permitting within our institutions and in society more broadly, right? So in other words, when we are trying to accommodate greater diversity within a context that, that is relevant for the development of knowledge, the accommodation of diversity is calling on us to express our commitment to inclusion and the sense of belonging that we would like to ensure that all of our members are benefiting from, to express it through restricting speech that might be denigrating or otherwise hurtful to diverse members of our community. And the struggles over speech are really reflected in the struggle over inclusion. So, for example, the way that it's operating on college campuses is that we are seeing disagreement over the extent to which a particular topic or a particular position should be expressed, given that, as in this case at the Yale Law School this past fall, given that even voicing a certain perspective is seen by some members of the community as rejecting their sense of belonging to the community. In this case, this is two speakers that were invited by the to a panel that was organized by the Federalist Society around the question of transgender inclusion or exclusion. And so we have here a speaker who is opposed to bills that are being proposed that restrict access to affirming care to transgender youth, and then a speaker who is sponsoring and promoting these bills that are restricting transgender care. And so some of the students feel that it's inappropriate to have this debate, right, because it reflects the exclusion of transgender members from their community, right? And so we have here a true clash between the effort to expand our knowledge in sort of a more scientific or, let's say, reasoned way, and the effort to make sure that we can really include all voices and all perspectives in the conversation. Some perspectives that are being accommodated here in this debate are seen and protested as perspectives that are maybe of interest when you want to learn the diverse political views in society, but are at the same time excluding or acting as exclusionary markers to other members in the community. And that's basically the struggle. The struggle is over what can we know and who can we learn it from, right? Who can participate in the conversation such that we are certain that we are hearing diverse voices while making sure that they are respected and accommodated with dignity as is required by a learning institution. Just a brief note to say, this is not new, and it's not about snowflakes, which is a common accusation. Here is a quote from 2008. It's the first time I heard this word. I was very excited. So, right, colleges are coddling students. They are not. So that's my view, right? I don't think the worry really is a worry about whether students are overly sensitive. I think this is a true and deep disagreement over how do you express your commitment to inclusion in a diverse community while advancing an open inquiry of diverse perspectives. Okay, So these are basically the council wars, the way that I understand them. I fail to follow my time here, so Colin, can you tell me where do we stand with time?
You have about 10 minutes.
Oh, perfect, great. So this is how I understand the cancel wars, and so what I want to talk about is how they are affecting colleges, and of course a little bit what we can do about that, and then we get to ask questions, which is the most exciting part of the evening. So the impact on colleges is really profound, at least the way that it is represented in the media, and in some instances, it really is affecting the way that colleges are operating. So we can talk about that. My sense is that affecting polarization is alive and well, unfortunately, on college campuses in the same way that it is in broader society. So we are seeing, for example, in undergraduate residential colleges, a strong preference from students not to be housemates or roommates with people who vote differently. So this, is a newer phenomenon that is typical of affective polarization, and we're seeing in other contexts an effort to create some distance from people who think differently from us. Struggles over the boundaries of expression, as I said before, right? So really very open and repeated struggles around speech that is seen as harmful, exclusionary, or in other ways inappropriate, and on the other side, the pushing back and demanding a broader set of, or a broader range of permissibility for diverse opinions and views. Increased engagement, I mean, it's a good thing if you don't, like big fires, as they do at Berkeley sometimes in the picture here. But we are seeing increased engagement, commitment, and students' involvement and faculty involvement in these issues, sometimes expressed through reduced tolerance and demands for adherence, as I said, right? So if you're on our side, you should never say this. If you're on our side, you have to make sure you say that, right? So we are seeing a lot of peer policing, right? A lot of demand that people abide by sometimes unspoken norms. And broadly speaking, because expanding knowledge requires open inquiry, this is a positive argument or a constructive argument that I'd like to suggest. Because expanding knowledge, which is at the core of the mission of the university, requires open inquiry, excluding some people from the conversation based either on their ideology or on their identity is harmful not only to the person who's being excluded, but also really to the capacity of the institution to operate in a way that is based in free inquiry, right? So in other words, if I'm behaving in a way or speaking in a way that silences some people in the room, particularly based on, some group affiliation that they have, they are, of course, maybe harmed, or maybe their feelings are hurt, or maybe they're just feeling, that I'm not respecting them appropriately. So it's bad for them. But I also want to suggest that it's really bad for what I'm trying to do as an instructor and what the university is trying to do as an institution, which is to advance knowledge, right? So inclusion really is not a matter of just being nice, although, I'm definitely not opposed to being nice, right? I think it's a good idea. But it's also required for the expansion of what we know. If some voices are silenced in a conversation, then the mission of expanding knowledge is limited, restricted. And so, there are also impacts on K-12 schools. I'm not going to go into that. I have a lot of opinions on this, as you can guess, but I'm just going to skip this part and ask of you to adhere by the request of this teacher in Florida to free the books. I think it's a very important that we let children read, but I'll move on from this matter, and I'm happy to talk about it to the extent that people are interested. There is a profound impact of the current struggles on the policies and practices of K-12 schools. And so what can we do about all of that? Really, as I was trying to outline, we have to make sure that our classrooms and our colleges, more broadly, our institutions of higher learning, both the more selective ones, the more elite ones like this one, and all the way to junior college or community college, commuter college, and everything in between, we have to make sure that these institutions are able to operate autonomously to the best extent possible, and that they are able to operate in a way that allows them to advance their mission. And the way that they can advance their mission is really through creating opportunities to exchange ideas in a way that recognizes all of their members as epistemic equals. In other words, as people who can contribute to this shared mission and conversation, right? If some people don't see themselves or perceive that they are not seen as people who can contribute to the conversation and to the exchange of ideas, the whole mission of the university is hampered. So engaged learning can definitely take place and has to take place primarily in the classroom, right? And there are a lot of practices that can support it. There are a lot of ways in which professors, instructors have to be ready to take the risk of either raising hard topics when they come up in class, listening to diverse voices, and also accepting those when students choose to bring them up, which is sometimes startling to an instructor, and so they sort of like move on. I think it's really important to dig into difficult topics in the classroom. Similarly, we have to create platforms and to sustain platforms that allow for people to engage across differences outside the classroom, right? And these are one of the most promising avenues, right? Allowing for different student groups or clubs or other contexts to engage across difference, as well as with the community outside of the school, and in a way that is openly and explicitly negotiating the boundaries of what is acceptable. And there is the story of this picture that I just mentioned, the story that takes place in New College, Florida, a few years back, of Derek Black over here, who was raised as a white supremacist and really engaged with students in his college to the extent that he was invited through their bridging efforts to join their community and to rethink some of the perspectives that he was holding before. It's a great story, and there's a good book about it, so I recommend. It's not easy, so just to say, like, I know it sounds a little bit Pollyannish, oh, let's create bridges and have difficult conversations in a civil way. I mean, I know it it can sound a little bit kumbaya in nature. I want to recognize that it's not easy, that it's a very messy effort, but I think it's really necessary in order for us to be able to do the work that universities are tasked with doing. So to explicitly work on negotiating the boundaries of what can be said within a context of a college is not easy, but it's really the main way that we can contribute to the effort of preserving democracy. So the payout is pretty good. Learning to trust, right? Trust as the basis of learning is really something that can be developed most effectively in an institution like a college or university, right? It's an institution where we are engaged long-term with diverse others, with a shared mission. This is how you develop trust, is, in your intro to psychology. So what you can learn through this effort is a trust in social institutions to the extent that they earn it. Trust in information and knowledge, right? So trying to develop knowledge together, doing the experiment in the lab, or reading the text together, or whatever it might be, in a way that supports trust in information and learning how to assess it. Trusting in the processes of developing this information, and the basic trust in others to the extent, again, that you can look at them with open eyes and make sure that they deserve it. These are the core ways in which we can try to start and rebuild the social foundations, or to mend the social foundations of democracy. And through this effort, creating common ground for the purpose of democratic renewal. And I just want to emphasize that I'm talking about the common ground rather than a middle ground, right? So the search is not for, where can you give up a little bit and I give up a little bit and we'll meet in the middle. There is no middle ground between true and false, right? Or there's no middle ground between hate and love, right? So not everything deserves to be averaged out and finding a space in the middle. However, there are always ways to find the common ground. Well, always is an overstatement, but there are often ways to find the common ground around questions such as, what do we share? Right? For example, what values do we share? What goals do we share? What do we know? Again, because these are primarily in a college, but also in a democratic context, an epistemic question. It's a question of what is the shared, common foundation of knowledge that we can agree on? And of course, what more do we want to know? Right? What more do we want to know, which is really the purpose of attending college or working at a college, right? What are the boundaries of knowledge that we have right now that we can expand? And really, when somebody is offering us an answer that is distasteful to us, I think the best response that we can start off with, and it's a response that I'm learning from Loretta Ross in her work, very much recommended if you're unfamiliar. The response is, tell me more. Tell me more. It's a more effective answer than you're canceled, right? Tell me more. This is what you think about the topic, and your answer is one that I find completely disagreeable. Tell me more. Let me understand. Why do you think that? Let's have a conversation about it. Maybe we will not find common ground, and maybe, my sort of like knee-jerk assumption that the person on the other side is acting in bad faith, as I said we are prone to do these days, maybe it will be justified in some cases. Some people are acting in bad faith, right? But I think it's worth the effort, particularly in contexts where we are, as I said, in a long-term relationship within an institutional context. And this is where I will stop and be interested in Liana's questions and in yours. Thank you so much. And of course, first I will need help with all the other matters. Thank you, John.
I'm just going to move your chairs for you.
Okay.
Thank you. Okay. Try speaking.
Hello, hello. Maybe I'm loud. There, that sounds good.
Oh.
There we go.
Okay. All right.
Awesome. Well, first of all, thank you so much for starting us off. That was awesome. It's a great book. I highly recommend. I think they're selling it out there. I wanted to start by just trying to understand a little bit better the scope of this problem, because I think, so often the depictions when we hear, phrases like cancel and all that, what we see sort of come from these one-off instances in the media, right? We hear on the news about this sort of egregious story that flies in the face of all of our assumptions. And it's Fox News, and we have all these associations with it. And by contrast, when I mentioned to my friends that I was, we were having this event on campus, I got a lot of, well, I don't know that we have a problem with that. Right. I don't see that in my life. So can you maybe just start with providing us a little bit more of a scope beyond just sort of these private sort of institutional contexts that we have, but more broadly, how you sort of characterize the scope of this problem and to what extent, these issues are really coming up.
Yeah, thanks, Liana. This is a great question, and it's really a great question because I think we are all very unclear on that, right? And I think our perceptions are not always aligned with the reality of our lives on campus. And so I would say this. First of all, the perceptions of the cancel wars on campus are more profound than the realities of them, right? So we are seeing organizations that are devoted to protecting open expression on college campuses, or we are seeing, as you said, one-off egregious events, and everyone then remembers them and thinks that basically what is happening on college campuses all day long is fistfights and fires and, as far less interesting than that. So the reality of our life on campus, as I think, most people would agree, is that, people go to class and they learn stuff and then they go to their different student associations and they engage around things that they care about, shared interests. Most of the sort of like mundane daily life on college campuses is not affected by this, contrary to the perception of a lot of people who are outside of this, outside of the campus context. At the same time, I will say this. The ongoing public and media attention, and I say media very broadly, so including like viral social media, snippets or claims that people make in not just in traditional media, but also the reality of this media attention is really shifting a little bit the way that people feel about raising concerns or about hosting events or about different things that we do normally on a college campus, like, oh, do I want to touch this, or am I going to go viral, or am I going to get canceled, or right? So the sense that the conversation, the public discourse about college campuses is most intensely looking at these topics is really maybe enhancing the concerns that we have when we make decisions, such as inviting a person, wading into a disagreement and the like. And one of the concerns that I have, and I think other people have as a result, is the concern about chilled speech, right? And chilled speech, or the self-censorship, right, or the decision not to touch something, a decision that both students and instructors sometimes make. This can be the result both of just concerns about hurting someone's feelings, which is a pretty good motivation, concerns about getting into trouble, concerns about somebody filming you, and also concerns, as I started off by saying, concerns about often vague or unclear, underdefined laws that are being passed about what you may or may not talk about, not in California and not in private institutions like this one. So you guys are not feeling that, but particularly public institutions in about a dozen states or so are feeling very intensely the results of laws that are chilling the conversation in classrooms and on college campuses, because maybe I want to teach something, but I don't know if it's legal anymore, so maybe I just change my syllabus, and that's really a concern, right? So in those a dozen or so states, it's a real concern, right? In other contexts, my sense is that it's a growing concern, but not in the sense of the ongoing clashes and fires and fights, but really in the sense of people choosing not to touch too many things.
Yeah, I mean that's something you talk about a lot in your book. You know, you have sort of a whole section dedicated to, you know, words, sort of very specific language, right? The language that we can't use. So specifically, you know, you think of racial slurs and things like that, and when they're acceptable to use in an intellectual context. And you provide, you know, various examples. I'm wondering if you have sort of a few that come to mind. But also sort of, you know, one of the things that you talk about is the pedagogical context and kind of a framework for, you know, assessing, is this sort of within the bounds of what we can say. Can you talk a little bit about that and about how, you know, professors and those who are here can answer, you know, should my speech be chilled in this way? You know,
right.
Can I avoid that?
Right. Yeah, no, that's a really important topic that you're touching on, and it's one of these areas that we see disagreements come up, and we sometimes even see a lot of, you know, we see sometimes like indignant responses, right? On the one side, why would you say that? And on the other side, well, I've always said that, why would I not say that, right? So the changing norms, and the fact that the norms are sometimes changing, well, they are clearly right now changing generationally, right? With greater attention from younger people to the ways in which their peers are interested in being discussed or addressed or included, right? What is appropriate to say about and to a person, you know, these norms are changing generationally. And I think some of these changes are creating a sense of surprise and discomfort among the older generation, right? Oh, you can't say that now. It used to be a good joke, and now it's not a good joke anymore about, you know, a certain group, or humor is changing, tolerance for various ways of talking about people and diverse identities is changing. And I think, you know, here's my view on that. You know, norms change. I think it's fine. I think we should talk about the way that they change and see what makes sense for a certain context. Like in my classroom, that's how we talk, you know, or this is, let's talk about proper norms of conversation. There is one case that I talk about in the book, which, you know, I have strong feelings about, and I think it's a case that was resolved properly, so I want to offer it as an example. And this is the case of Jeffrey Stone, who's a professor of law at Chicago, and who wrote himself about his experience, which, you know, I criticized in the book, but then he endorsed the book still, so like, and he is a law professor, and he used to illustrate the case of the fighting words doctrine. For those of you who are familiar, it's not so important for the story, but he used to illustrate it by telling a story, a true story by his account, which I have no reason to dispute, about how he was teaching about this, and one student was demonstrating it by calling the other student with a racial slur, right? To sort of like demonstrate that racial slurs, so a white student is calling the black student a racial slur, and the black student gets very mad. And in this story, this demonstrates that words can be defined as a fighting words, and that the doctrine, the legal doctrine, is still an appropriate and valid one. And so Professor Stone is telling this story in his class for, he's saying, I don't remember, maybe 20 years, right? That's how he's talking about the fighting words doctrine, and he's mentioning the N-word as he's telling the story. And he's saying, this is perfectly fine. Why is that fine? I'm not using a slur. I'm not calling a person a slur. I'm telling a story, and in the story I'm mentioning a slur. It's a part of the story. It's an important part of the story. And he insists, he's a, strong free speech scholar, of course, and also defender. And he insists that he's allowed to do that and should be allowed to do that. And at some point, a group of students, primarily black students, come to visit him in office hours, and they tell him, here's how that makes me feel. This is a majority white institution, and your class is a majority white class. And here is the small handful of black students in your class. And you are saying the N-word in class, to demonstrate something. And to tell a story where, in the story there is a black student who gets mad and punches someone or lunges at someone wanting to punch them. It just feels terrible, to be in your class and listen to this story. And so, so he decides to stop doing that. And I think it's a pretty good decision, right? I don't think it's always and in every case impermissible in the sense that it should be regulated away. And I don't think the university, definitely not the University of Chicago, would take the step of saying, you can't say that in the classroom, right? Having speech codes is a very ineffective practice. But here's a way where we can talk to each other and reach a decision that, in my view, is a good decision about a very touchy and difficult topic. And I think that learning in Professor Stone's class is actually enhanced rather than impoverished by his decision to change his speech practices. So, because you have people who are feeling more respected in his class, who are not feeling uncomfortable or excluded, and so they are more likely to speak. And so we're just having a better pedagogical environment. It comes down to boring things like that. You know what I mean? Like, it's just a better context for conversation. So, okay, fewer words are spoken, right? Racial slurs are not spoken in class. I think it's fine.
So I want to ask a little bit about some of the trickier contexts where, the conversations that we want to have, and you talked about these a little bit in your talk earlier, are about, belonging in and of itself. Mm. And I think, one that comes to mind for me that comes up so often in a university is when we talk about university admissions, right? Because the central thesis, and a lot of what you say is that we start from this place of, well, everyone deserves to be here engaging in this conversation. But a discussion about admissions, part of the reason that they end up so touchy is that you're sort of saying, well, in this institutional academic context, maybe, not necessarily that people don't deserve here, but sometimes it can end up feeling like that. Mm-hmm. So in a situation like that, how would you deal with the complexities there?
Right. So that's a really important issue, which of course right now is shifting under our feet with the as we await the decision about the Harvard and UNC cases from the court. I say the following. First of all, when we admit a person to college, there is some unspoken statement that we are making that they belong there, right? And so we're not just saying your accomplishments so far, your achievement, make you deserve to, mark you as somebody who deserves to be here. We are also trying to indicate that they really are members of this community, right? That they really are epistemic equals, again, right? So they are people who can benefit from being here, but also can contribute, right? So I think universities have a responsibility to act on that, right? And to ensure that this is actually uh, reflected in their practices, in the way that they operate. And that doesn't, it becomes controversial, you know, with some decisions like, okay, if I have to make sure that everyone belongs, is that just a negative requirement in the sense that, okay, I'll be sure not to discriminate, you know, I make sure that I don't have, that I don't, sorry, that there is this really amazing book that's really not read so much anymore called Three Guineas by Virginia Woolf, and she's talking there about like visiting the women's college, you know, when they were separate, and she's like saying, okay, I joined the women in their college for dinner, and I have to say that dinner was not good, right? The dining halls for the women was inferior, right? Was just less well fun. It, you know, it didn't have the nice couches. It didn't have the smoking room that was a popular thing for the men's college. It didn't have good food, right? Because they didn't have money, right? So, you know, the women, you know, belong there and they can make a contribution and they can come to class, but they should suffice with a not very good dining hall. So obviously discrimination, you know, of this sort, right, is inappropriate, right, and we all recognize that. So, okay, so there is a negative requirement not to discriminate, right? But I really think that there are some positive requirements as well. For example, we need to provide context where students can feel comfortable and at home. We need to, we need to ensure in everything from like our calendars, you know, do they accommodate different holidays? I mean, these are things that by now are more broadly accepted, let's say, but each of them is a fight, you know, and so we ought to recognize what are the steps that we need to continue taking in order to make sure that everyone really knows that they belong because they live there, so for, you know, that they belong in this as their home, like can they, you know, use the bathroom comfortably to talk about something that also has been controversial in, you know, in some places over the last few years, to everything else, right? And so all of these, each of them, the holidays, the bathrooms, right, the how do you identify yourself on the forms that are given? All of these require attention to questions of belonging. How do I make sure that you know when I'm admitting you that I really want you here, right? And I want you here for the duration, I want to hear your contributions, right? So some of these are administrative and, you know, they require sometimes, let's say, a conversation. And some of them are about what we learn and what we know and how do we think together and how do we like advance knowledge together, all of these things that I've tried to talk about. So, yeah, okay, so this is my answer.
No, I mean, this is great, and I this idea of sort of positive requirements and what the university can sort of actively be doing to support students. I want to talk very specifically about something that's happening on Stanford's campus in a few weeks. As we're bringing a speaker who's sort of relatively controversial to this campus. A lot of people are sort of angry about it. You know, we had Mike Pence here last year. There were sort of calls again to deplatform a lot of things that you talk about in your book. Can you, I mean, you advise lots of colleges. Can you sort of provide advice both to students about how to handle sort of a speaker like this who they might find distasteful, but then also, you know, how the university should handle this and sort of what their positive requirements for making sure that students who might feel harmed by this language are still sort of continue to be, you know, what the university can do to sort of reinforce that sense of belonging even in these sort of difficult situations.
Great. So this is one of the difficult topics that we are seeing, you know, for maybe a decade now. And it's still, you know, in some places feels like it's more resolved, you know, through policy and grown norms. And in some places like here, it's still a live topic. Okay, so here are a couple of initial suggestions about this. First off, about the decision who to invite. I often advise both students and universities, so student clubs or groups who do a lot of these invitations, as well as faculty and the university itself, who sometimes, invites people for commencement or other events. And I say, first of all, make sure that the person you are inviting is interested in having a conversation, is interested in the engagement. What is in it for this person? Are they using the university, are they using the university as a way to advance or to pontificate or to try and persuade people or to improve their brand? Or are they looking to engage and have a discussion where they are open to a conversation about ideas? What is it that we can learn from them? So that's one question. The speaker, do they have the same cause that you have when you're inviting them? That's one question. And the other question that is sometimes distinct, is this person a person with power already? Mike Pence, right? Whatever anyone's view on him and his views might be, positive or negative, office holder, he's out there making decisions. You don't have to listen to what he's doing, but he's still there doing it, So my sense is that if the person either already has power, so you might want to learn about his thinking and his decisions, or the person is interested in engaging with you and shares the same mission as you have, rather than just being incendiary or inflammatory, then it's a good person to invite. Either way, it's going to be your call. When I say your call, the Center for Ethics can decide who they invite. The college Democrats can decide who they invite. So every unit at the university have their own decision-making power. I don't think it's a good idea that somebody, well, the dean just had to go, but let's say the dean, she's going to make the decision. Everyone has to come to her or to some committee, and get the approval to invite anyone. That's not a good idea, because you don't want to give this kind of power to anyone. So this is one thing, right? So how do you decide? Well, units decide for themselves. I have my guidelines that I just offered you, the two of them, but it's still the prerogative of each unit to make this decision. Now, what do you do when somebody has invited a person you dislike? I think you really have a few options here. One option is to go and listen. If you think that they might say something that would be of interest to you, even in disagreement, right? So maybe it will clarify to you what is it about their thing that you so disagree with, right? So you can come not with the goal of necessarily being persuaded, but learning something about their views, about your views. So that's one option. And you can also do that in protest, right? You can come with a sign, you can come with, some kind of marking on your clothes that expresses your disagreement. You can come with flyers, to explain your opposition, So there are ways that you can join in without being complicit if you worry about sort of strengthening their voice by attending there. And there are, I think, effective and important ways to protest that students do and should take on. We just had a conversation about protests over lunch with a few students, and I really think it's important that the university is as open as it can be and as supportive as it can be to students' voices through protests, right? To the extent that the event is still happening, I think it's a really important part of student engagement and participation and civic development and all of these good things. So you can protest. And lastly, you can cancel the event, not in practice, but you can call it off in your mind. Just don't go, a lot of people, decided, for example, not to be right here in the front row, like they're open seats. They're not coming. Where are they not coming? I don't know. They're busy. They're not interested. There are a lot of events taking place. Maybe they are at a different event. It's all good, right? So this is your decision, what you give your attention to. A lot of these events are a game of attention. And sometimes even the protest is a form of attention. And you can decide if this event, the one you talked about, or any event, is one that you are looking to call out in your protest, to call in by participating, or to call off, right? All of this, again, using Loretta Ross's construction, which I think is very useful as sort of like a set of options that are available to you. And lastly, just to say, the university in almost every case should not do anything about that. It's not the university's core, right? If a student group, as in this case, or a center or a professor is inviting someone, the university really should not have a say in that. There are very few exceptions to that, in my view.
I love that language of calling in, calling out, or calling off. I think that's such useful language.
Q&A.
Q&A now? Okay, great. We're moving to Q&A now. Awesome. I will, let's see, we have mics going around. We have mics almost going around. We can probably start with that mic. Are you loud? You can be loud. Right there, yeah.
Oh, I'm definitely, yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah. I'm Lee Levine, I'm a historian in the graduate education. Thank you so much, Sigal, for this wonderful talk and the deep contextualization of these issues. I don't even think I need it, but I mean, I'm happy to do the speak. I don't know.
For recording purposes.
Okay, great. Yeah, and just really nuanced and illuminating talk and Q&A is really wonderful. An exemplar of civil discourse, indeed. So my question is, you say that the university is a manifestation of the erosion of our democracy, but it's also a key player in the theater, right? I mean, it's almost an arbiter, to use your term, in your itemized list of the different kind of sort of institutions, the players in the playing field. So it's a site of the battlefield, but it's also an actor, as you say, rightly so, because it advances knowledge and it disseminates knowledge, and so could you just help us thread that needle a little bit more? What conceptual framework do you use to think about the unique sort of role of an educational institution for encouraging speech that is also inclusive? You have free speech in the title of your book, but I know, as you say in the pages, and we've talked about, the university is not a town hall and it's not the internet. You don't actually talk about academic freedom.
The internet will soon not be the internet also.
Right. So all of these spaces are changing, but the university is a unique place. So, you've mentioned epistemic justice and epistemic equals. Is that the framework? Is academic freedom? Is free speech? Can you just say more about sort of how we think about the university specifically as a place for speech?
Great, thank you so much for this, Emily. And I would say briefly that my framework for that is to think about free inquiry as really the main tool that we can use at the university in order to try and reverse some of these trends, the truth decay, the exclusionary practices. I think those are mostly addressed through free inquiry, and the university is a player, an inadvertent player for the most part, maybe a site for some of these battles, because the university is seen both as a place where you develop knowledge, and we are currently struggling over the meaning of knowledge and truth, right? So the university is a good place to fight over, to struggle over these disagreements, as are the courts, right? And so you see, and as are some of the scientific, scientific institutions, including the scientific bureaucracies, like the NIH and the CDC and other, right? So all of these are places where knowledge is developed and disseminated and anchored, right? And so when you are looking to expand or change or redefine what knowledge and truth mean, then these are the places that you would go. I think for universities to address the fact that they've become flashpoints for these disagreements, the framework that I would recommend that they use is a framework of open inquiry, which means a framework that gives equal value to open expression and to inclusive practices that ensure that everyone can participate in a discussion about knowledge and truth. So, yeah.
Yeah, see if they're doing something. Perfect, yeah, right up there, yeah.
Hi, my name is Julia. Thank you so much for coming. I'm an undergrad here at Stanford. In the beginning of your talk, you talked about how the final goal for the university is to acquire knowledge, but that can't necessarily be achieved if some people are excluded and therefore can't really contribute to the conversation. How do we determine if people are excluded, like on what grounds? Is it just their feelings or testimony of feelings, or is it something more robust than that? And with this sort of domination of feelings as a sort of perceived blockage to being able to participate, how do we go forward with the pursuit of open inquiry if feelings, which is something so abstract, is often what is the challenge?
Great, that's a great question. It's really great, and I think it goes to the core of the issue that we have here today, because if I tell you that you hurt my feelings and as a result I don't want to participate or I don't want to respond or I cannot take part, what more evidence do you have, right? Just because I said my feelings are hurt, now, the conversation has to be over. And I think it's a real challenge, right? Because here is what I'm thinking about it. If I'm, let's say, in the context of a classroom, I'm coming to the instructor and I'm saying my feelings are hurt about something that happened in class or about what is on or not on the syllabus or whichever other matters. My report of hurt feelings, in my view, is both conclusive and not enough. Okay? So hear me out for a second. Report of hurt feelings is not only just abstract, as you said, it's also very subjective, right? And it's possible that something that hurts my feeling would not hurt your feeling, even if you were in the same position, right? So I cannot use the measure of like the reasonable person or, some kind of an average or a scientific, calculator. I don't know. There is no other evidence to hurt feelings beyond the fact that someone who I have in my class or I have it, I lives in my dorm or whatever it might be, tells me that their feelings are hurt, right? So I think a report about hurt feelings or other kinds of feelings is conclusive. That's all the evidence you need. However, that doesn't tell you what you need to do, right? And so the fact that somebody's feelings are hurt doesn't mean that we have to cease all action around whatever is the matter, right? Actually, in my view, what it means is that we need to have some kind of conversation. okay, what is the source of the hurt feelings? Why do you think this is a problem? What would you like me to do? Here is what I would like to do differently and why. So like the conversation that I reported from Jeffrey Stone, and that you can read in his own words, he published some public articles on this. This is a conversation about hurt feelings. So his students, particularly the black students in his class, were telling him, you're hurting my feelings right now. He's heard that before, and he decided not to act on it. At some point, he figured, you know what? It's fine with me to respond in a way that restricts what I'm saying or not saying in my class. It's his call, right? So the decision about what to do with hurt feelings is a relational decision rather than a policy decision, right? It's a decision that has to do with how am I choosing to create norms in my class that I see now as an instructor, right? Which I see as conducive to what I'm trying to do in my class, right? So it's a very local, right? It's a local and relational decision rather than, as I said, a policy about here are words you may not say. Right, which again I know is a live topic on this campus. So it's not an effective way to address concerns about harm, to declare a list of words that you cannot say. I think rather what needs to happen is within the local context you have to operate in a way that addresses the hurt feelings. Now I just want to say, because you started off, Julia, by saying how do you know that someone is being silenced, right? And, to some extent, it really depends on the context you're talking about, because if it's like in a class, then you can just see, here are the, is there some difference, in who participates? For a long time, it's not the case anymore, but for a long time there was large surveys that show that women don't speak in co-ed classrooms. It was decades long, and it's really not so much the case anymore for the most part. There are some exceptions. So that they don't speak because you see them not speaking, right? But in other cases, you ought to listen to what they are telling you. Here is a student group or an organization or somebody comes to talk to you. So I think a lot of it is self-report, and what it calls for is relational solutions and local solutions. That's where I'm.
Let's see. Oh, over there? Yeah. Okay, great. Over there on the right.
Hi, I'm Linda. I'm an undergrad. Thanks so much for your talk. I wanted to focus on what you were saying about belonging, and specifically, to what extent do you think discomfort is a necessary part of the university education?
What is a necessary part?
Discomfort.
Oh, great. Well, yes. So thank you. This is a great question again. And I think discomfort. Okay, so I want to distinguish between two types of discomfort, because I'm a philosopher, and so I love distinctions. That's my thing. So here is what I would say. I think intellectual discomfort is an essential part of learning. I listen to something, and then, I'm being taught, and, I'm feeling, a little bit extended, right? Oh, that's not how I understood things, right? Or that's not what I believed, or that was not my perspective. And here you are, either my peer or my professor, shedding a different light on it, and it's uncomfortable. And sometimes extremely so, and sometimes just because it's a hard concept. So intellectual challenges, intellectual risk-taking, and the discomfort that accompany them, I think there is no real learning without them, right? They are necessary. But at the same time, I think that there are some types of discomfort that actually restrict or undermine learning. And this is particularly what I would call dignitary discomfort or dignitary risks. So in other words, if I say things as an instructor, if I say things that denigrate, humiliate, shame, or create a sense of exclusion towards some people in my class, I'll give you the example that I hear most often. If I, as an instructor in, particularly in engineering, for some reason that's what I hear it most, make comments about the women who are the minority, a smaller share of the class. Oh, women would know this, women would not know that. Now that there are women here, here is how we are talking about this, right? So if I continuously make small remarks that are creating a sense of shame and discomfort and lack of belonging, to the women in the room, then I think that this discomfort is actually not conducive to learning, right? So this is a kind of discomfort that is reflecting the undermining of their sense of safety and belonging as epistemic equals, right? Why are you here? I don't know. Why should you be here? Women should not be here. So you sort of get this needling, this ongoing sense of, my professor thinks that I shouldn't be here, right? And so this is discomfort that doesn't help you learn. Whereas the other type of discomfort is actually part of the process of learning. So that's how I'm thinking about, taking risks and going beyond your comfort zone, as part of learning, particularly for young adults. That's it.
We are out of time, so thank you to Professor Sigal Ben-Porath and to Liana.